Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 752. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. Today, we feature our interview with Laura Belmayne. We discuss the confluence of fast-growing companies and security. Maybe I should say collision instead of confluence. Note, Laura provides an incredible amount of wisdom in the interview. However, due to a user error, I lost the first minute of the interview. The abrupt start of the interview means we hit the ground running with very little preamble. Laura Belmayne specializes in securing some of Australia and New Zealand's fastest growing organizations. She has over 20 years of experience in software development and information security. It is her mission and passion to bring security into organizations of every shape and size. Laura is the founder and CEO of SafeStack Academy, an online education platform offering flexible, high-quality, and people-focused secure development training for fast-moving companies, with a focus on building security skills, practices, and cultures across the entire engineering team. SafeStack is a values-driven company on a mission to make cybersecurity accessible for everyone and any organization. Are you ready to talk security and fast-growing organizations? It's time for the conversation. Laura, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast. Let's dive right in. Laura, why does it seem like fast-growing organizations and cybersecurity, those two things don't go together? Are they an oxymoron?
And so we can often feel like it's this waste of time. We can't see the monster, we can't smell it, we can't see it coming, so why do we need all the process? And I think it's about time that, particularly for our fast-growing companies, that we step back from the process side and really understand what vulnerability means and how, instead of seeing this as something that's going to slow us down, we can see it as something that can refine us, that if we measure it well, can help us go faster, build better quality products.
I'm a fast-growing company. I'm going to get some policies. I'm going to put them on the table. I'm probably going to staple them to a developer or two's head so that they can, the other ones can read it while they're coding. Why can't I go down that path and then just make people follow it?
Well, full disclosure, I would never condone hurting a developer with a stapler. That's office space, next level. But how many times have you been told, I'll be honest with me here. People tell me, Laura, you should go to the gym. Laura, here's a document that tells you going to the gym every day is going to make you happy and healthy. And here's how it's going to extend your life. And I've got all of these bits of paper that tell me all these things. And yet, that's not going to change my behavior at all. The security isn't about the process and the policy. The process and the policy helps us be repeatable in how we do things, but it starts with a behavioral change. It starts with a culture. It starts with a shared understanding that, hey, development team, you care about quality already. You care about performance and scaling, usability, accessibility, observability, lots of these ilities. Security is part of this. We call this defensibility. So if it's part of quality, then we should care about it alongside everything else. And that stops being someone else's problem. It stops being another team. It stops being about policy and process. And it starts being about doing a good job. Being a great engineer is about considering how to defend it as well as to build it.
And I was really wondering how you were going to get security into an ility. And so, kudos for defensibility. How do we make that point? How does that actually get into somebody's head? How do we make people understand what that really means?
But for me, the way that I do it, I've been teaching this now for too many years. For though you can't see me, lovely audience, but there's a lot of grey hairs hidden by a lot of blonde hairs. For me, it's not about telling people thou shalt. It's not about setting rules and saying follow this. It's about showing people the creative process that is security. And you were very, very good at this when you were young. It's like children, particularly preschoolers up to age 7. If you ask them to, can you break into a room and steal a thing? They don't care about law or physics. They're going to come up with a solution. If you ask them to defend a thing, they're going to deploy Batman and dinosaurs, and they're just going to go at it. They don't care about the rules. They see it as creativity, as play. And we can teach security in the same way. If you consider threat assessment, for example, which is a process where we look at built architecture or a planned architecture, and that can be a rough whiteboard diagram, or it could be a more formal diagram that you've, done through a larger process. And if you looked at that and did your equivalent of planning a bank robbery or whatever it is you have value, you can turn that into a really interactive, really collaborative experiment that tells you the who, why, and how of why this architecture of the system might be vulnerable. And the thing we tend to forget when we're teaching is we focus on, the syntax, or you should write this line of code, or you should deploy this tool. But what we don't focus on is an attacker, the people we're trying to protect against, they're objective focused. They want money or fame or ego. It's not about your technology. They don't care if you're using SQL or whatever. That's just the tool they need to figure out to get to what they want. They are coming at this purely from there's a shiny thing there I would like to achieve. How can I get there? And all routes are in. All pathways are open. And so by turning our security training into something that's fun, that shows how that pathway, that creative thinking works, we can spot a lot more opportunities for defense, and even sometimes refine our designs and architectures as a result, because we can notice there's vulnerable pathways that perhaps we didn't really need or could have been achieved in a simpler or more pragmatic way and reduce the risk.
So having coded a few years of my life, I didn't code my life, but I coded during my life. I think I would be safe to say that a lot of people in the business see security as somebody else's problem. That it's that security department over there, they go to the conferences, they get the security training. I have to do this, at least here in the States, I have to do this security awareness thing once a year. And, it'd be really nice if I could actually stay awake during it because it's generally so boring. Whose problem is security? Who owns that?
It's everyone's. It's everyone's.
But if it's everyone's.
So there's two sides. There's the management of security, which, and the governance and the programs and things. And there will always be specialist people who do that on this, as their role. Because particularly if you're in a larger organization, there's quite a lot of work needed to plan those budgets and the strategies and the tooling and all those kind of things. And that's fine. We're going to park that over there. But when it comes to the actual implementation and following security, when we put it all in a separate team, we intentionally narrow our view of what is happening. So in security, there's three things we wanted to be able to do. We want to prevent things, so stop bad things happening, detect things, so spot it quickly if a bad thing is happening, and then respond. Now, preventing, there are things that definitely a security team would do, normally more in the infrastructure side or those big holistic pieces that take care of large systems we all share. But then there's small things that each of us can do. Like, in the normal user awareness space, this will be choose a good password, which, P.S., we're all terrible at, even though we sat through those training modules. That tells you how good our training is. We spend more time choosing our socks in the morning than we do a good password. So, who knew?
You wear socks?
Sometimes. It is subtropical. But I have heard that, you lot do snow and stuff. So I assume you like keeping your toes warm. Anywho, we digress. So, absolutely, there's those little tiny things that everyone does. But then we move into our engineering team. If your organization has, for example, let's say pick arbitrarily 300 engineers, which is going to be bigger than some of the companies that are listening and much smaller than others. And you have a security team that represents probably less than 5% of that headcount. And that's still generous. You cannot scale a security team to be across 300 engineers' work. You just can't do it. You can't review every piece of code. You can't look at every design choice that's been made. And so it's sensible at that point to go, well, if we can't scale that way, then we need to save that resource there, that specialist security resource for those really hard problems. And we need to empower and enable the engineering team to own and understand those risks and take steps that they deem appropriate to resolve them. And that's actually a little step further than most companies are doing right now, because we say, hey, it's everyone's problem, but we don't give them the autonomy and the accountability and the agency to then take that and run with it. So that's where we need to head with it.
So if we distribute that agency, and I would suggest I agree that that's a great idea and something that's important to do, how do we know that it's actually happening?
Yeah, measure. I have a really sweet spot. A real passion project for me is: are we doing this right? Is it working? I'm a big fan of data, so I've got I love trusting my gut instinct. Oh, this feels about right, but reality is we don't have the time for that. So finding ways to measure is important. In security, what we often see people say is, "Hey, we only had 3 incidents, and therefore we're winning." Or we only found 50 bugs in our code and we found 30 the month before, so we're winning. But those are not leading indicators. I'm a big fan in security of us finding a leading indicator of something is improving. And there's two schools in security for doing this. There's product security. So this is, what have I built into my product that are an indicator that it would survive the types of attacks that we would see? So that's the as built. If I'm going to build a widget, is this widget built in a way that would demonstrate the ability to prevent and detect attack? And then we have lifecycle maturity. And that's measuring the initiatives we put all the way through our lifecycle, from design all the way through to maintenance, and how consistently we apply those to what breadth of the code base or the project's going through. Now, ideally, you want to do both of those. So you want to measure, have I hit all the requirements I need and as built functional requirements for security in my software, but equally, am I making sure that every line of code, regardless of whether it's the fancy widget or a marketing site, every one of them is going through these steps consistently? And I think if you combine both of those and you can see that velocity, those are good leading indicators that you're going to be prepared for security incidents. You're going to detect them quickly and know how to respond.
Okay, so I buy that as a leading economic indicator of security. But at the same time, especially when I first start doing this, how do I know that that actually is the right stuff to be doing, that I'm doing the right, building it in and actually doing the right steps along the way?
It's really tricky. I'm sure many of your listeners buy insurance, for example, for their home or their car. And it's one of those things where if your car hasn't been stolen or your house isn't on fire, you can kind of sit there and go, well, why really am I spending the money on this? Is this actually helping me in any way? And security is a bit like that. There's no really very easy way for us to tell, is this working, unless a bad thing is happening. And the logical extension of this is saying, well, to prove this, we have to have everyone be hacked all of the time, and therefore we'll know. We don't want that. It'd be a terrible idea.
I think at that point we would know that it wasn't working.
Well, the nice thing about attackers is they are infinitely creative. So what they will find is that all of the things you've done will work perfectly well, and then they'll find crazy new things, and then we continue to evolve. I think I've made my career in an unwinnable space, essentially. I like the idea that you can never have all of the answers. There's always somebody bright who's going to come up with something new.
Well, that's fair. And that actually creates a career that you can do for long periods of time. I've, lived in coding, testing, and process, all of which are, I think, a similar unwinnable game kind of scenario.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But again, I guess I'm troubled. It's everybody's. We have perhaps a team that helps us set up the infrastructure, perhaps the policies, those sorts of things. And then we look at security as insurance. And sometimes insurance scares me because I think it allows people to get lazy. And
absolutely.
So maybe there's a better metaphor for that. But okay, so we have this security and people are focused on it. When at some point, I think, especially if we're going to get external insurance, we're going to have to go down the compliance route. And again, I think there are some pluses and minuses to compliance. How do you view the whole idea of compliance in terms of security?
I have a complex relationship with compliance. So full disclosure, I'm a reformed auditor. I've moved on. I've repented. So, compliance was my world for a small while. But I think compliance has a place. Particularly when you're trying to communicate security to external people. Say, for example, your organization is selling to a larger organization or a government body. Pointing to a compliance scheme saying, hey, we did meet all of these basic requirements is a much quicker process than somebody going through everything you're doing in comparison to their policy and, feeling it out. At least we've got something there. But for me, I see it as table stakes. It is the base level. It is not security. Compliance is a set of controls that will get you aligned with security, but it is not security itself. Being compliant with something is a license to play. It's more of a business requirement than it is a technical protection. Compliance schemes are also often backwards looking. So they are sets of requirements, either implicit or explicit. So they can just say, hey, do good security stuff, or they can say, hey, have passwords that are at least 6 characters long, depending on how opinionated they are. But they're all based on how systems were built once. And they update fairly infrequently. So say every 4 years, for example. Now, as a result, if you're building really innovative systems or at a fast speed, you can sometimes find these compliance requirements don't marry up well with the reality of the software the organizations we're building right now. And that can be very frustrating as somebody who's trying to either meet them or trying to meet them and then exceed them because you want to go fast and do something amazing. So I think, compliance is a burden we're stuck with because we don't have a better way of communicating a shared language as to how risk is going to affect each other at the moment. But I think we have to stop seeing it as the end result and see it as the table stakes to get started.
Yeah, there's a lot of auditing, at least here in the States, a lot of auditing for a new security, basically standard, again, at least in the federal government and federal government contractors. So I see a lot of that activity, and honestly, I did a lot of assessments before in my life. So maybe not an auditor, but an assessor.
I don't judge.
Well, heck, I'd do it again. That's the scary part. I'd do it again. But, a lot of times I think you're absolutely right. The audit findings or the assessment outcome become the thing that's important to people versus overall, whether it's security or something else. When you talk to people and do a keynote, let's say, on the risk of security, how do you actually communicate the risks that are apparent just when you get it wrong and when you stop thinking about
it? I do quite a lot of speaking, and particularly in the last couple of years, for me, the focus is less on what's going to go wrong. So I genuinely believe, and I'm a little contrarian in this for a security person, that for most organizations, security isn't the scariest monster you're facing right now. For a lot of organizations, making payroll, particularly in the last week, has been a little bit scarier than it should have been. Finding good people will bring you down first. Now, that doesn't mean security is not important. It just means you have to put it into perspective. For me, instead, the more important story here is the reality of how our systems that we build and our organizations work is really key to understanding security. So when I build a piece of software, I'm not writing every line of code anymore. I'm not operating as like an isolated engineer. I use libraries and frameworks and components from all over the world, from the open source community, from closed source, and that creates these connections, this transitive risk. So those components that I've chosen to use bring with them vulnerabilities that I don't control. And I use them in a way that perhaps they weren't even intended, which creates its own set of challenges. And if you start connecting out our ecosystem like that, between integrations between platforms, relationships between companies as vendors and suppliers, you start to see that it's not really just about us. It's not about one of us or one line of code or one piece of software. It's about the cumulative effect if one of those pieces in the network fails. Now, there's some amazing books out there, even just outside of the tech space, about the network effect of connection between people. And there's a really great book. I'll send you through a link, Tom, that you can share with your audience. And it's free. It's out of one of the big universities about network connectivity between humans. And the research they did of how influential just damaging or removing one component of that human network was to the entire cohesion of the ecosystem. Now, if we logically extend that out to software and then organizations, what we find is even a small component, one node library, one framework in Java, one small player at Silicon Valley Bank, when you take one of them out, we have a ripple effect across entire communities and across entire ecosystems. And I think what we need to do is understand that the risk that we pose is not just to us, it's to everything we're connected to. And the risk we face isn't just our software, it's everything we're connected to too. For example, if you use a big cloud provider, it's a great target for an attacker. Heroku last year had a really bad time after a compromise when 9,000 organizations were at risk. And those organizations had done nothing wrong, but their cloud provider had had a security incident. And I think we need to start approaching it in this way, this connected way, where we understand that it's not just one of us. Every one of us taking a bit of responsibility makes the whole ecosystem stronger.
How do you get that point across to people that are used to, and let's face it, having owned several businesses, sometimes it's real easy to take a very insular view. How do you get that network effect across without it sounding like you're overly academic? And I am interested in making payroll this week. Don't tell me. Obviously, that's easy for me, right? I pay me. But that sounds so, and obviously we know it's right, but it sounds ethereal. How do you get that point across?
Well, so I kind of, firstly, I cover crippling anxiety with bad jokes. That tends to go down well and, lightens the load a little bit. Security talks are not fun things. We tend to be, the least fun at parties, tax, death, and cybersecurity. The other thing I do is lean into the amazing technology we're building. I don't think you can be a technologist or a security person and not be excited by at least one technology that's being built right now. If you're not, go be a plumber. You can make just as much money over here, at least. And, you're just dealing with other types of problems for other people. We rely on stories. So I talk about, the technologies I love. I'm really a big fan of the future of robotics. I think there's some really cool stuff coming out. I think there's some terrifying, military stuff coming out too. But it's a lot of cool stuff. There was a really great video this week from the Imaginarium out of Disney about humanizing robots. And they made a little roller skating robot, an inline skating robot.
That. Yeah.
And it's adorable. And when you start talking about technology as the change it can be and personalize it, making it more human, more relatable, it stops being, hey, this is dollars and cents. And it starts being something you can connect with emotionally. The other thing I think about and talk about with audiences is how our brains work. There's a whole bunch of biases that naturally mean our brain will filter out and go, this is not important to me. Things like recency bias. This didn't happen to me recently, and therefore it's no longer a problem. This thing is physically far away from me, and therefore it's not like me because it's too far away, so it must not be the same thing. And when you kind of, a bit tongue-in-cheek and very openly call out the fact that our brains are literally trying to stop us caring about things that can, feel big and scary and too far away, then it feels like actually we're probably all fighting the same thing, and that, it feels a little bit more achievable. And the other part of it is I explain a big picture, but what I'm asking people to do isn't a big thing. It's one little tiny thing. I end up asking engineering teams to try and think about doing 1 hour of security work every sprint. 1 hour, that's it. And that's a tiny amount, but there's 30 million software engineers in the world right now. And if you did 30 million times 1 hour, that's actually a lot of time. And so if you can give people really tangible ways to spend that hour, and I've got a cheat sheet, that's here's what you could do with your hour that would add some value, and you can make it small and manageable and kind of call out that this is very surreal and unnatural to us, then it becomes a thing we can connect on together and make it okay to say, hey, this is hard and dumb and I have no idea what I'm doing, but none of us do, so let's give it a shot because we have to.
We'll come back to that cheat sheet because I think I'd like the listeners to at least know where to go to find all that kind of stuff from you. But before we go down that path, you've been at this for a little while, and whether it's SafeStack or your auditing career before then, what is it that if you had to point to one piece of information that developers lack and their bosses lack about security, what would that one piece of information be?
I think the biggest aha moment I see with engineering teams is when they realize that security is already what they're doing. Like QA folk, for example. I love QA. I did a brief stint doing testing very early in my career. And many of them, when I first start talking to them about security, they start by minimizing. Oh, I'm not really technical. I'm a QA person. Or I don't do the coding stuff. I'm a QA person. And it's awful. It's really, truly terrible. If you're that QA person, don't do that. But the process, the way their brain works, the way that they can, look at a machine and go, all right, it has 6 buttons and I have 10 fingers. What can we do here? That instinct, that's exactly the same mechanism an attacker uses. And so by realizing you're already doing it, all we're doing is reframing this, that is a very powerful thing. For those engineering, just understanding that an attacker isn't some sort of wizard. Security tools are not some magic box. Essentially, a lot of them are regex in a pretty dress. So we can turn this into, who are the people we're trying to protect against? They're people just like you. They write code. It's terrible code. They think about how your code works. They try and reverse engineer it. And again, just realizing it's the same thing. They've just got a different motivation set.
If you woke up tomorrow morning and someone handed you your caffeinated beverage of choice and a magic wand and gave you the power to change any 2 things that affect security, what would those 2 things be and why?
Oh, that's a hard question, Tom. That one's mean. Okay, all right. Let's think about this. For those playing along at home, he's literally cackling here. All right. So, what would I change if I could change 2 things? I would stop security relying on fear, uncertainty, and doubt to sell. Because we spend a lot of time telling the whole world the sky is falling, monsters are coming to get you, and it will destroy your company in the next 5 minutes. And when you tell people consistently that bad things are going to happen, it's like every fable and myth you're told as a child. If you tell somebody scary things all the time, they will eventually say, hey, just go away, please. Come back when something's happening. If you look at the stories like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Chicken Little, we have literally dozens of stories we tell our children that say, do not do this. And then we made an entire marketing model out of it. So let's not do that, because when we don't do that, we can actually cause some really high-level scrutiny on some of the claims that fear, uncertainty, and doubt have made. And if we look at the data behind it, instead of just the emotional reaction, that will help us make better decisions. The second thing I would do is free puppies. No. It's so hard. I think I would instantly give anyone who's trying to support a development team an insight into the realities of a development team's life and day. So one of the biggest mistakes I've seen in a leadership team or a security team trying to come and support their secure developers or their development teams is they go buy them a gift. I bought you this thing. It's going to do security for you. Here, go put it into your world in your life cycle. And their life cycle, say it was their DevOps pipeline, was currently taking, 3 minutes to deploy. And they stick this tool in, and suddenly it takes an hour and a half. And that lack of understanding, that lack of respect for the world that those systems and those tools and those changes are impacting creates a horrible cultural barrier between the 2 areas. So I would love for the 2 worlds to understand each other a little bit more. And so developers understand that security folk, we're sacrificial lambs. If something goes wrong, we're the ones who are going to lose our job. So there tends to be a little bit of anxiety there. Let's just have a group hug, a cup of tea, and figure that one out. And security folk realize that engineers love solving problems and they love going fast, and they're wired to see puzzles and not to kind of tolerate inefficient systems. So when you give them a lot of changes that break systems or change things or make it inefficient, you literally directly hit into their values and their wiring. So that bit of understanding, I think, could change the world. But if not puppies will help.
Yeah, I'd argue that nothing is worth, that bacon and puppies, those would be 2 things that you could add pretty much to anything. The whole idea of selling through fear, obviously, probably not every, but almost every course in salesmanship tells people to sell through fear. Fear or pain, one of those 2 things are, highly motivating. And if we step away from selling it that way, and I agree, I could walk in to one of the kids' rooms and find a Grimm's fairy tale and find some of those fairy tales. Is that just because we have to sell and that there is a security industrial complex that says we have to continue selling to exist?
Oh, I think that's probably a bigger question than I can answer. I think there's probably a lot of psychology in there that would need to be unpicked. But I think when you look at how things evolve in terms of marketing and selling, we will spot what works and what doesn't, and we will build upon it. If you look at the old school days of print advertising and the 1950s initial boom of mass advertising, mass marketing, there's still themes of what was going on there that we still see echoed today in terms of, showing the lifestyles we would like to achieve and, that aspirational marketing. And we even saw it back then, but more on a health front normally. The health and safety concerns, don't do this, you'll be poorly, or don't do this, or, your children will not be strong. We've just built on that over time. It's really, really hard to get people to care about security. It's in that big problem bucket, like the environment, like, anything that you feel like you're a tiny, tiny piece and how could you possibly impact that thing? Security is like that. And so people will always pick the easiest path to it. I just don't think it's the right path.
I agree with you. And I also think it's just like insurance. It's if you build it in, and hopefully you have, it's there and no one ever sees it. So therefore, people are going, well, why can't I have more functionality? Well, I've got to do this. So there's that natural conundrum. Laura, if people wanted to continue the conversation, how would they find out about you? Where would they find you on the web?
Awesome. Well, you can find me in various places. LinkedIn, do come and connect. I love to meet new people. You can find me on Twitter at lady_nerd. The underscore is important because the other lady nerd doesn't do security and she'll be very confused. If you wanted some free training, genuinely free, no gimmicks, no credit cards, no tricks, and as CEO, I get to promise that one, you can visit safestack.io. We have a free plan open to all organizations all around the world, and you can get 50 free seats on our Essential Secure Development training program. There you go, just get stuck in. And then finally, we'll be doing some events all around the world. So we'll be in Atlanta later in the year for Render. We're going to be in San Francisco for QCon and for RSA Week. So if you are at a big US event and see us around or see me around, come say hello. If nothing else, I really love to hear when I'm wrong. So if you've got strong opinions, come and tell me, because I love a good conversation, a good debate.
Absolutely. That would be, hopefully our listeners will connect. At this point, I open up the platform for you to promote anything else that you'd like. So the platform's yours.
I think what I would say is whether you're a teeny tiny organization, nonprofit, just you're working on a hobby thing, or whether you work for a giant corporate machine and you're a tiny little part of it, there's some incredible things that everyone's doing right now in tech. And if you're not excited, find that excitement, go and do it. It's really, really important. Whether you secretly want to be an astronaut as a kid and you think space tech is the future, or whether, you've got a reason to think health tech and medical is really important because it's close to your heart. And then find a way to care about these things more than just the dollars and cents, because security is never going to work if we just care about the profit margin. We need to care about the people. So find the thing you care enough about where you can find the human impact of security, and that's going to change your world, because then you'll start caring a little bit more and maybe change your behavior. And please, for the love of all that is pink and fluffy, just change one password in your life, because we are terrible at this. So until we've replaced passwords with something else, let's do a bit better.
Laura Bell-Main, CEO of SafeStack, thank you for sharing your wisdom and throwing down the gauntlet in terms of getting people to interact with the software process and SPaMCAST listeners.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It's been great fun.
In Reread Saturday News, Chapter 3 of Team Topologies, Organizing Business and Technology Teams for Fast Flow, is titled Team First Thinking, Using teams to get work done in all walks of life is undeniable. Whether the idea of team emerged a century ago or less than a week is less important. What is important is the knowledge that very little work happens without teams. Team-first thinking makes simple sense. Remember, buy a copy, read along, links in the show notes to this week's and all previous installments of Reread Saturday on team topologies. In the next Software Process and Measurement Cast, we will return to our discussion of fatalism to examine the relationship between hierarchy, fatalism, and engagement. We'll also have a visit from Tony Timble, who will bring his To Tell a Story column to the podcast. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?